So at the weekend, the assassination of Daria Dugina, the daughter of philosopher Alexander Dugin, hit the international headlines. Alexander Dugin is an incredibly mysterious figure. He's sometimes referred to as Putin's brain or Putin's Rasputin in the press, even though there isn't really any official connection to the Kremlin. I'm delighted to discuss this with Benjamin Teitelbaum, who's the author of the brilliant book, The War for Eternity. He's also written a fantastic piece for us on Spike this week. And he's one of the few people who's actually met Alexander Dugin and so can really, give us an insight into what he's about. And before we move on to talk about the assassination itself, Benjamin, could you just tell us who is Alexander Dugin? Why is he significant? Why is the assassination of his daughter an international story? Why does it matter to us?
It's very difficult to say in briefly exactly who Alexander Dugin is. You could call him a philosopher, you could call him a media personality, a publisher, you could call him a networker, a political fixer is another term. You could call him a sort of pseudo-diplomat. He has an eccentric background that includes occultism, wild drinking by Russian standards, sex parties, rock and roll, flirting with dressing himself up in Nazi uniforms and things like that. And yet this very strange figure who's so many different things has found his way also not so much into the halls of the Kremlin, as you mentioned earlier, but on an international stage that is sometimes very lowbrow and involves him speaking to and becoming a sort of darling of the international alt-right. Little boys in their parents' basements is a fine opening frame for that. Alternately, someone who ends up being invited and gaining audiences with international diplomats and in some cases international leaders. So how did he get all that? The other thing that it would be important to mention just in an opening presentation of him is that he's an ideologue who's tried to develop a philosophical justification for Russian expansionism, something that goes beyond merely saying that, okay, the Russian state, the bureaucracy, has a right to assert itself in places that it can. Instead, he sees that Russia has a role to play in a grand history, a fight between liberalism and tradition, between individualism and collectivism, between secularism and the sacred, and that Russia was destined to fulfill the latter role in all those cases. So yes, he advocates Russian expansionism. He wants to see Russia assert itself where it can, but he thinks that this has a sort of eschatological function for it, and it's that area where he's been compelling as a thinker as well.
And how does that fit into the war in Ukraine? Because that seems to have also, raised his profile internationally. He's probably one of the most famous cheerleaders for the war in Ukraine. But that he's given it kind of spiritual significance, I think it's fair to say. Is that right?
Absolutely. What he sees in Ukraine is not so much the expansion of Russia, but rather the potential expansion of the West in liberalism. I think it's easier to think about what he doesn't like than what he likes in the war, in the conflict, rather. He thinks that liberalism from the West, in its DNA, essentially, is expansionist. It thinks that its values are universal and therefore it will never be able to hold itself within any set of boundaries in any way, shape, or form, however you want to think about boundaries. And so it's constantly pushing, and now it's pushing in Ukraine. And the one thing that Russia could do to blunt liberalism is to stop it, is to assert a boundary someplace. And if you assert a boundary in one place, then it can't be universal any place. It changes its DNA in that sense. So that's the sort of deeper significance he sees here. There's also the more predictable rhetoric and justifications relating to history, that Ukraine is part of the Russian cultural sphere. It's part of a Eurasian cultural community, in other words, whose deep essence belongs to the East and not to the West. And what really needs to happen in his mind for all of those societies is, if it's the Baltics, if it's Ukraine, if it's Georgia, it's not to develop in a Western model, it's to return to what they actually are and always have been, which is Eurasian, with a center being in Russia.
And how does that fit into his more kind of occultist, obscurantist view? Does he see Ukraine as a kind of satanic force, or the West as a kind of evil in that sense?
In the sense that it is secular,
Mm,
and in his mind also leveling and destabilizing of traditional collectivities and identities. That's how he sees it. The evil in Ukraine, it could be Azovstal, or the Azov fighters. That's kind of the public face of it. But at a deeper level, he thinks that the evil is the West. It's nihilism. It's when he talks about occasionally transhumanism, he sees that as a sort of progression that the West has been on, moving from pulling God out of society to pulling humanity out of society, and that we're on a path to something, some evil AI, artificial intelligence, robotic future in the West, and that's who we are.
And let's talk a bit about the assassination itself. His daughter is starting to become was starting to become a figure in her own right. Is that fair to say? And certainly since her death, she's been treated as a kind of martyr of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that right?
Well, he's trying to do that.
Mm,
I don't know how resonant that particular version of her is, that she is a martyr for Russia's cause, for Putin's cause. She was coming into her own right. There are some indications. I never met Daria, but there are indications that, as you would expect, with a child of a famous parent, that she was tired of living in her father's shadow and she wanted to break away. But really, up until this point, what she had been is a somewhat softer face, and spokesperson for his ideas.
mm,
That's just how it was, and her life ended without really being able to change that dynamic. She wasn't especially well known in Russia outside of specialist circles, likewise in Ukraine, but she is now, right?
mm,
So when I say that she's okay, I don't think she's widely recognized as a martyr. She's maybe some sort of symbol. Her death could be symbolic of Russian incompetence or the threat of Ukraine, or however you want to frame it. But that's where she is right now. But perhaps all of this interpretation and narrativizing of her death that we've seen in the funeral following and in press might turn her into a martyr. We make martyrs after the fact; they don't make it of themselves, of course.
And she was in Ukraine at one point. Is that right?
Yes, she recently traveled. I believe this was in July. She was in Mariupol, in the
Mm,
in the Azovstal factory, where the Azov fighters had made a last stand before capitulating to the Russians. And she moved around, took selfies of herself in the factory. Some of the things that she said while she was moving through there was that the place was possessed of some sort of dark satanic black magic. It was an evil place. Again, there's narrativizing of this military conflict to make it a battle between good and evil, and that's certainly something she was participating in then as well.
And we talked a bit about how Dugin himself has tried to narrativize this assassination. But what are the other kind of competing narratives around it in terms of who might be responsible? How is Ukraine trying to frame this? How is Russia trying to frame this? What do you think about that?
There have been many. Some are in the media and some aren't. Right. I think the earliest claim of responsibility I heard was a sort of Chechen warlord dissident. Framing this as punishment for Russia's actions in Chechnya, and then we heard from Ukraine, actually a former pro-Ukrainian Russian MP, now resident in Kyiv, said that he had received a claim of responsibility from a domestic Russian anti-Putin terrorist organization or partisan group, however you want to call it. And in their case, this was retribution for Putin. It was also, I think, for the Ukrainian media in that case,
Mm,
it was an opportunity to put out a narrative of instability in Putin's Russia. Okay, the dynamic in the war seems to me and some other observers to be slightly turning back toward Ukraine at this point. And then guess what else? The murder of Daria shows how weak Putin is internally. It adds to that broader narrative. That's of course the opposite of what we are hearing from Russia, which is that these are murderous, deviant, intolerable Ukrainians who
mm,
did this. And in that case, we have their official account that a former Azov fighter came into Russia with her daughter with her IDs, with her license plates on her car and everything, and committed this act and then escaped to Estonia. So all that narrativizing is going on this entire time.
The Kremlin has put out a response to the killing. I mean, clearly, the fact that it has happened gives Dugin a kind of new significance. I think it's fair to say. But what do we really know about his connections to the Kremlin?
We know more than what a lot of journalists have been reporting these past days, if I may speak frankly. So in the past, some of Dugin's texts have been read by a generation of military leaders. We know that some of his rhetoric, if we were to follow British journalist Charles Clover, that some of his rhetoric has been adopted by Kremlin mouthpieces. The Kremlin uses him, amplifies him at times when it is, facing a conflict with the West. But beyond that, because all that you could hear by a more informed voice. We also have U.S. intelligence reports that Dugin was sent as a sort of pseudo-diplomatic emissary of the Russian state to Turkey in particular. And that's just one report. I think we could assume that this has happened other times since then. That was in 2004. In 2015, if we are to believe the words of the former head of military intelligence in Turkey, Dugin played a role in back channeling between the Kremlin and the governments of Syria and Turkey. And what he did in that instance was enable a potential diffusion of tension between those three states following Turkey's shooting down of a Russian fighter jet in 2015 when everything was exploding around Assad. It's those types of actions that we get small windows into. They coexist with a bunch of failures and a bunch of foolish, goofy-looking behaviors on Dugin's part. But they have to be grappled with as well. This is someone who I think does not have an official position, but is trusted and used by the Kremlin because of his currency with certain foreign actors. That doesn't make him Putin's brain. That doesn't mean that he's sitting in the Kremlin and whispering things to Putin at the end of these long tables. But this wave of commentary saying, "Oh, Dugin is irrelevant and he's always been irrelevant. And now this is going to lift him up." That's not true.
We've talked a lot about his philosophy, his significance, but you've met him a few times. What is he actually like as a person to interact with?
He's one of these people. I don't know if you've ever met one, Fraser, but they have so much energy that they kind of overwhelm you. His English, it's heavily accented, but it's very effective. He has a large vocabulary, and he talks a lot. He talks a lot. He fills the room with words. He speaks quickly. He seems to have an opinion on everything. And he attracts people to him, I think, for that reason, in part. Quite ironically, the person that he reminds me of in that respect is Steve Bannon, former Trump, and I wrote a book on actually their interactions with one another. But that's how he is. He seems like a philosopher. People like to also say that he's a bad philosopher in some way, and I don't know what a good philosopher is, but he's an intellectual. He likes to talk about ideas. He's not aggressive. He's not disagreeable in person by any means, but he is radical. He is absolutely right. You come away from him thinking that, okay, this is a person with a more polished, less threatening exterior, but his ideas, I always thought, struck me as more radical than if I was sitting down talking to some young neo-Nazi or someone, who in their outward presentation was supposed to be threatening and radical.
Benjamin, thank you very much for coming on the Spike podcast.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Fraser.